First let me welcome everybody to the Thomas Wolfe Memorial. I'm Tom Muir. I'm the Historic Site Manager at Thomas Wolfe. Thomas Wolfe Memorial, a venerable historic site in Asheville, first became a memorial in 1949. Today we operate as a state historic site. Our main program, a guided tour of the old Kentucky home, the boarding house where Thomas Wolfe lived as a child. The tours leave our visitor center here half past each hour through the day. In the visitor center and where we are now, we're surrounded by exhibits with lots of personal objects related to Thomas Wolfe and his family. You can enjoy self-guiding our exhibit gallery at any time, and we also show a 22-minute film in our visitor center about the life of Thomas Wolfe. Thomas Wolfe Memorial, in addition to our daily program for visitors, both local and out-of-town visitors, we have a series of special events through the year. One thing that local visitors can participate in is a monthly Thomas Wolfe short story book club that meets, and we have wonderful discussions of some of Wolfe's stories that were published as time went by. Our visitor center at 52 North Market Street is adjacent to the old Kentucky home historic boarding house that Thomas Wolfe will immortalize in his first book, Look Homeward, Angel. The house, the lone survivor of a Victorian neighborhood once adjacent to downtown Asheville, was built in 1883, a 7-room single-family dwelling at that time, built by a local banker, probably one of the finest houses in Asheville. No electricity, no plumbing yet at that time, but by 1890, the house had been converted to a boarding house. About that time, it got its first flushing toilet inside, downstairs, and a little early electricity installed. And it is the house that Thomas Wolfe's mother, Julia, will purchase in 1906 for $6,500. And her plan is to go into the boarding house business, take advantage of the booming tourist trade here in Asheville. And so he was uprooted from the warmth and abundance of his father's home at an early age and brought to live in a house, 18 rooms at that time, with strangers coming and going all the time. And it's a story that he will then write about in his autobiographical fiction, Look Homeward, Angel. And so visitors today who come to Thomas Wolfe Memorial will appreciate a very rare experience, an author's home where he actually spent formative years of his life and then again immortalized in his first novel, his first fiction. If you've read Look Homeward, Angel, it can be a very emotional experience to see the places that he wrote about in his book. For someone who's never attempted to read Thomas Wolfe, once you've come to the memorial, taken the guided tour of the house, the book really becomes exciting and lights up as you recognize the places that he describes in his book. As you go through the house on our tour, a lot of visitors are excited by Julia Wolfe's kitchen, where she'll spend a lot of her time. Thomas Wolfe wrote that his mother was out of bed before 7 a.m. working there, and at 2 a.m. you could walk into the kitchen and find Julia Wolfe still ironing linens for the tables in her dining room the next day. The house is full of bedrooms. Again, at the height of summer, Julia could have some 30 people staying in the house. So many of the rooms have multiple beds. Sharing mattresses was still common in this time period. You could lay down in that bed to sleep early one evening, wake up next to someone you'd never seen before, a fellow traveler in Asheville. Upstairs, as you go through the boarding house, one of the highlights of the tour is the room with the bay window in it. Thomas Wolfe wrote that it was a dark, gloomy room with an ugly bay window. And it's probably the most dramatic piece of Look Homeward, Angel, where Thomas Wolfe describes the scene where his favorite brother, Benjamin Gant, will die in the Spanish influenza in October of 1918.
My name's Todd Bailey. I'm an attorney in Burnsville, North Carolina. I've been in the Wolfe Society since 1992. I served a term as president, and so far I've only missed one meeting in all those years. Thomas Wolfe was a gifted writer. He's been called the best poet since Whitman. I think his legacy is that he is an enduring part of American literature, and people still continue to find relevance in his works. I did the high school American literature term paper on Thomas Wolfe. I guess I was in my teens then and had read Look Homeward, Angel and enjoyed it. Looking back, I probably chose him partly for provincialism because he was from here, but also because he's probably the first time I ever heard of an author before I even really knew what a novel was. He came through Burnsville in 1937 on his way home, visited some of his mother's family, and wound up seeing a shooting. The people that were in the shooting wound up with a murder the next week, so he got called back to testify at the murder trial that summer. So there are all sorts of locals that had stories about Wolfe, and I even knew the murderer at the Hilltop restaurant growing up, and it was just sort of a fascination with me. And then I left it away until later years, reading The Great Gatsby, and there's that line, "You can't repeat the past," and Gatsby goes, "That's silly, of course you can." And I started thinking about you can't go home again, and you can't repeat the past. And I knew that both writers had Asheville connections, but I didn't know the extent of it. I came to Peck Library and did research and found about their common editor, Maxwell Perkins, that they were colleagues of the 20s and 30s, and fell in with the Wolfe and the Fitzgerald societies and started putting it all together. Some people think Wolfe was a one-book man, that he wrote Look Homeward, Angel, and that was the only thing that was any good. Some people thought his works were suited for shorter works, like short stories and short novels. Some people think at the time of his death, he was just starting to develop a mature consciousness and would have become a better writer. And infamously, the critic Harold Bloom has opined he could not write at all. There wasn't any question about it. But Wolfe has always been popular. He burst on the scene, and as opposed to Fitzgerald with the rich excesses of the 20s, his stories were more appropriate for a Depression-era generation. He's always appealed to young romantics and people that enjoy more lyrical works. I enjoy the last of his posthumous novels, The Hills Beyond. It's a collection of stories for the most part, but it's stories about North Carolina. One of them, he writes about the character coming through Burnsville, which he called Zebulon. And you know, I knew of people that he writes about and can see how he just, his memory and detail was impressive, his ability to conjure up things, but he writes about the divisions between Eastern and North Carolina and the differences, and I just find that historically interesting. Well, even when, before Wolfe died, he referred to it as that old dilapidated house that should be torn down, but my mother loves it so well. It seems fortuitous that after Mrs. Wolfe died, the family worked to establish it as a memorial, and it eventually was sold to the city, which ran it for many years. The first time I went through, the city was in control of it. You paid 50 cents and you could walk in any room and do anything you wanted through it. In more recent years, you certainly can't tour it without a guide. There are even some rooms, because of the fire code, you can't go through. And then in 1998, during Bill Scher, it suffered the fire that damaged about 2/3 of it, which had pros and cons. It destroyed a good part of the building, but it resulted in a restoration that has guaranteed its success. I've actually been sitting on the front porch of the house and had visitors come out of the Renaissance and say, "Tom Wolfe, did he write Bonfire of the Vanities?" So it educates, and you know, it's interesting to see a house that old, shows what the neighborhoods were like. It's also an example of historic preservation. There's many ways to view it. It's amazing to me how I can go to a Wolfe Society meeting and some scholar will come up with some angle or thought that you never would have come up with. And they keep doing it with a lot of the authors, but I think those are the ones that have enduring appeal, the ones that can survive passage of time.
My name is Terry Roberts. I'm a native of Western North Carolina, and I have studied and read and thought about Thomas Wolfe for decades. I've taught Wolfe to high school students, I've taught Wolfe to college students, and I think he's a vastly underappreciated author and someone who should be much better read and understood. And to that end, today I'd like to talk about how Wolfe was inspired by his mother's boarding house, which is a state historic site. And to begin with, I think I would say that there are two large categories of inspiration that we should think about. One is a kind of pleasant, interesting thought, and the other is a not so pleasant, but also interesting thought. The first is that because Wolfe was in and out of this house from the time his mother purchased it when he was a child until he left for the University of North Carolina at age 16, he was around a constant stream of boarders, some of whom were very wealthy, some of whom were rather poor and could barely pay to live here. In Wolfe's case, the boarding house gave him a kind of intimate look into the lives of people that otherwise he would have never known nearly as well. A second part that's also interesting but not so pleasant to think about is that when his mother bought this house, she moved here from their family home, which probably could have been seen from the front porch. It was only about 1.5 blocks, 2 blocks away on Woodfin Street. And so Wolfe is a classic case, psychologically, of the child of a broken home. And in Wolfe's case, it wasn't just broken because they lived in separate households. It was broken because his father and mother carried on what Wolfe called a kind of warfare over the years. Psychologically, emotionally, W.O. Wolfe and Julia Wolfe could not have been more different as human beings. She was interested in property, she was interested in acquiring wealth, thrifty to the point of painfulness almost. And so what you see here in the dining room of the old Kentucky home where I'm seated today was the launching pad for what Julia Wolfe hoped would eventually become a small fortune, particularly in real estate. W.O. Wolfe, on the other hand, her husband, had almost no interest in acquiring property. He had almost no interest in acquiring wealth beyond what one could spend on a day-to-day basis. He had almost no interest in opening the doors of his home to what he called a teeming horde of misfortunate and misbegotten boarders. And so where I'm seated on any given day, boarders would have been seated eating the lifeblood, W.O. would say, a fine meal, Julia would say, cooked on her stove. So instead of cooking for her family, Julia was cooking for income. She was selling what W.O. considered sacred, which was hearth and home. And so this was a kind of broken home that was not just broken geographically, it was broken emotionally and it was broken psychologically. And that brokenness was played out in a drama that lasted for years. Now, how did that contribute to the making of Look Homeward Angel? Wolfe himself, in later years when he became a writer, had the psychological burden of somehow trying to synthesize both what his mother had given him on one hand and what his father had given him on the other hand. And so those two forces, if you can imagine two things trying to come together and be merged in one psyche, that was the war that was going on inside Thomas Wolfe. And in a sense, we're the beneficiaries of that. I once heard someone say, when they were talking about this kind of crazed synthesis, emotional, intellectual, psychological, of these two warring forces, that in a strange kind of way, you're talking about a recipe for an artist, because this was someone who struggled throughout his entire lifetime to take these two forces and somehow merge them.
Thank you for exploring the Thomas Wolfe Memorial with us today. I hope we've piqued your interest and that you'll come visit us soon. We're here Tuesday through Saturdays from 9 to 5 with tours at 1/2 each hour, starting at 9:30 each day. So please come down, bring your company with you, and discover the world of Thomas Wolfe in Asheville.